You know, one thing that really stood out to me in this book?
What's that?
It's how Wright emphasizes individual responsibility in all of this. Like, it's easy to feel like ethical tech development is somebody else's problem, you know?
Yeah. Like it's all on the big tech companies and the government to figure out.
Exactly. But Wright argues that we as individual users have a huge role to play. We're not just passive consumers of technology.
We're active participants shaping how it develops and impacts society.
Exactly. So what can we as individuals actually do to promote ethical tech?
Yeah, where do we even start?
Well, first of all, we can be more mindful of our own tech use.
Like actually stopping to think about why we're using something and what the potential downsides might be.
Exactly, like asking ourselves simple questions. What am I using this for? Why am I using it? Are there any downsides I haven't considered?
And then once we've thought about those questions, we can start making choices that align with our values. Like if privacy is a major concern, maybe we choose services that prioritize data protection. Or we're more careful about what we share online.
Exactly. Or if you're concerned about the environmental impact of all this tech, maybe you try to reduce your digital footprint, you know? Buy less stuff. Keep your devices longer. Repair them instead of replacing them.
Those are great ideas. And beyond our individual choices, we can also use our voices to advocate for change. Support organizations that are promoting ethical tech development, hold companies accountable for their practices, contact our elected officials to push for regulations that align with our values.
Exactly. We have more power than we think to shape the future of technology.
It's a bit empowering to think about it that way. But I have to admit, it's hard to know if a company is truly committed to ethical practices, or if they're just doing what Wright calls ethics washing.
Right? Just putting on a good show without actually changing anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we spot the difference? What are the signs of genuine ethical engagement?
Well, Wright points out that it goes way beyond just having a code of ethics on your website.
Because anyone can write a fancy document full of lofty ideals.
Right. It's about actually embedding those principles into the company culture, the decision-making processes, the DNA of the organization.
It's got to be more than just words. It's got to be reflected in their actions.
Exactly. And it's about being transparent. Companies that are genuinely committed to ethics are open about their practices, their challenges, even their failures. They're willing to admit when they've messed up.
Instead of trying to hide it and hope nobody notices.
Right. And crucially, they're willing to learn from their mistakes and make changes.
So transparency is key. What else should we be looking for?
Accountability. When things go wrong, who's responsible? Are there clear procedures for addressing ethical violations?
Do they have systems in place to investigate and prevent future problems?
Exactly. And are they willing to be held accountable both internally by their employees and externally by the public and by regulators?
So it sounds like we need to look for companies that are walking the walk, not just talking the talk, being transparent, holding themselves accountable, having systems in place to back up their ethical claims.
Exactly. And remember, as consumers, we have a lot of power. When we demand ethical practices and support companies that align with our values, we can actually influence the direction of tech development.
That's an encouraging thought. One of the sections I found really helpful was where Wright dives into the specific ethical challenges of different tech sectors. It really made those abstract concepts feel more concrete.
I agree. It's one thing to talk about ethics in general, but it's so much more impactful to see how it plays out in real-world scenarios.
Exactly. Like in the software development section, he talks about designing systems that are not just functional, but also ethical.
And he stresses that those ethical considerations need to be baked into every stage of the development process, from the initial design all the way through to deployment.
It can't be an afterthought. Like, oh, wait, we should probably think about the ethics of this now.
Right. It's about anticipating potential ethical issues from the get-go and designing systems that mitigate those risks.
And thinking about the broader societal impact of the technology, like who will be affected? What are the potential benefits and harms? Are there any unintended consequences we need to be aware of?
Exactly. It's about broadening our perspective beyond just the technical stuff and considering the human and social dimensions as well.
That's crucial. And it applies to all the tech sectors he covers, right? It's not just software.
Right. He talks about biotech, AI, cybersecurity, fintech. It's a real whirlwind tour of the ethical dilemmas facing our world today.
And it really highlights how these ethical considerations aren't limited to a specific industry. They're woven into the fabric of our lives now.
Exactly, which is why a book like this is so important. It gives us a framework for understanding and engaging with these complex ethical questions.
As we're talking about all these different sectors, I realized we haven't really touched on what Wright calls sources of guidance for navigating these ethical challenges.
Oh, good point. We need some resources to draw on when we're trying to make these tough decisions.
Exactly. So what are some of the sources of guidance he suggests?
Well, he starts with personal and shared experience. What have we learned from our own encounters with technology? What can we learn from others who faced similar dilemmas?
Makes sense. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we encounter an ethical challenge. There's a lot of wisdom out there we can tap into.
Absolutely. Then, of course, there are legal frameworks and regulations, even though, as we've discussed, the law often lags behind technological advancements.
Yeah, it's always playing catch up.
Mm.
But even if the law doesn't have all the answers, it can still offer some guidance.
Right. And then, of course, there are those ethical frameworks we talked about earlier. Consequentialism, deontic ethics, virtue ethics. They give us different lenses to view the dilemma through and help us weigh different values and considerations.
So it's like having a toolkit with different instruments for analyzing the situation and coming to an informed decision.
Exactly. And Wright emphasizes that ethical decision-making is an ongoing process. We might draw on all these sources of guidance, weigh the different factors, and come to a decision.
But then as we learn more or the situation changes, we might need to reassess and adjust our approach. It's about being flexible and adaptable.
Exactly. And being willing to have those tough conversations and challenge our own assumptions.
I appreciate that Wright doesn't shy away from the messiness of it all. He acknowledges that there aren't always easy answers.
And sometimes we have to make tough choices even when there's no perfect solution.
But the important thing is that we're engaging with these issues thoughtfully and intentionally, trying to do the best we can with the information we have.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the ethical considerations, grappling with them honestly, and being open to learning and growing as we go.
Which brings us back to that idea of ethical agility, being able to adapt and respond to the constantly changing ethical landscape of technology.
I think that's a great point to transition into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some of Wright's concluding thoughts and the book's overall message.
All right, so as we wrap up our deep dive into ethics, law, and technology adoption, I'm curious,
About what?
what are some of the big takeaways here? What does Wright really want us to walk away with?
Well, one of the big things that stood out to me is that ethical tech development isn't just some, nice to have. It's essential.
Yeah, it's not just a bonus feature.
Exactly. Technology is so intertwined with our lives now. It shapes who we are, both individually and as a society.
And if we're not careful, it can be used to manipulate us, exploit us, even undermine our values.
Right. But Wright's book also offers a sense of hope. He argues that if we engage with these ethical questions thoughtfully, intentionally,
If we really put in the effort.
and technology can actually be an incredible force for good. It can help us address some of the world's biggest problems and create a more just equitable and sustainable future.
It's a powerful vision, but it requires action, right? This isn't going to just happen automatically.
Definitely. The book really emphasizes the need for collective action. It's not enough for individuals to make ethical choices, although that's important. We also need to push for systemic change.
Okay, so what does that look like? What can we do at a broader level?
Well, he talks a lot about the role of government and regulation.
Which can be tricky, right?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. You don't want to stifle innovation, but you also need some guardrails to prevent harm and make sure technology is being used ethically.
It's like finding that sweet spot between progress and protection.
Exactly. And it's even harder because technology moves so fast. It's difficult for regulations to keep up.
And then you have the global nature of technology to consider. Like a law passed in one country might not have much impact on a tech company that operates worldwide.
It's complicated for sure. But Wright argues that regulation is essential. It can help level the playing field, establish some baseline standards, and protect individuals and society from harm.
So where does he see the biggest need for regulation?
He talks a lot about data privacy, which is obviously a huge concern these days. Our data is being collected and used in ways we might not even realize, and we need better protections.
Makes sense. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about algorithmic bias too.
Right. That's another area where he sees a need for regulation.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that algorithms, which are increasingly being used to make decisions that affect our lives, are being used fairly and responsibly.
And that those who are developing and using these algorithms are held accountable.
Exactly. Accountability is so important.
It seems like that's a recurring theme throughout the book.
It is, and it makes sense. As technology becomes more powerful, the stakes get higher, and we need to make sure that power is being used ethically.
I think it's safe to say that ethics, law, and technology adoption is a pretty timely and thought-provoking book.
Definitely. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the complex relationship between technology and ethics.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
And for all of you out there, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the ethical implications of new technologies? What are you doing to promote ethical tech development in your own life?
Share your thoughts on social media. Let's keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ethics, law, and technology adoption.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep learning and keep diving deep.